Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Faye Rosenfeld. I am the Vice President of Public Programs here at the New York Public Library, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Live from NYPL. So tonight's program is inspired by and in many ways a sequel to the library's new exhibition entitled The Equal Rights Amendment, A Century of Speaking Out. This exhibition is currently on view in the Rayner Wing on the third floor of this beautiful building, and if you haven't seen it yet, I really, really encourage you to do so. The exhibition uses materials drawn from the library's extensive archival collections to trace the 100-year history of the ERA. From the earliest draft presented to Congress in 1923, to the battle over its ratification in the 1970s, to more recent efforts at the state and federal level to achieve ratification. And I want to recognize the exhibition's amazing curators, my NYPL colleagues, Cara Delat and Ian Fowler, for their extraordinary work. Cara is here with us tonight. Cara, congratulations. So tonight's conversation picks up where the exhibition leaves off, with three extraordinary panelists who, following in the footsteps of leaders featured in the exhibition like Alice Paul, Crystal Eastman, Shirley Chisholm, and Martha Griffiths, are at the forefront of putting the Equal Rights Amendment back on the national political agenda. Carolyn Maloney is one of this country's most distinguished, most tenacious, and most effective public servants who has been fighting for the rights of women for her entire political career. During her 30 years representing many of us here in New York City as a member of Congress, she introduced numerous pieces of legislation on feminist issues and was a especially persistent and tireless advocate for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. This is work that she continues to perform as chair of the ERA Coalition, as the newly elected president of NOW New York State, and as the Eleanor Roosevelt Distinguished Leader at the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College, which also happens to be my former place of work. Carolyn is the recipient of numerous awards, including just an hour ago, the Edie Windsor Award for her service to the LGBTQIA community, and we are extremely grateful to her for literally racing across town to be with us tonight. In true Carolyn fashion. Christian Nunes is the president of the National Organization for Women, an organization that is synonymous with feminism and the struggle to achieve full equal rights for women and girls in all aspects of social, political, and economic life. The New York Public Library has a long association with NOW. Not only is NOW's history and leadership prominently featured in the ERA exhibition, but Betty Friedan, co-founder of NOW and the person who actually coined the name of the organization, wrote portions of her seminal book, The Feminine Mystique, right here at the NYPL as a resident scholar in the Frederick Lewis Allen Room. Since becoming president of NOW in 2020, Christian has spearheaded many new initiatives, including Unlock the Future campaign, which demands humane treatment for detained immigrant families and women and girls, 100 Days of a Feminist Agenda, which is a partnership with Black Women's Blueprint, racial equity training across all levels of the organization, and much more. Kate Shaw is a professor of law at Benjamin Cardozo Law School. A renowned expert in constitutional law, she is co-director of the Floersheimer Center for Constitutional Democracy at Cardozo. She is also co-host of the truly fantastic podcast Strict Scrutiny, which examines the Supreme Court and the legal culture that surrounds it. And she's also an ABC News analyst. Earlier this year, she and Julie Suk published an op-ed in the New York Times laying out the many reasons why they believe a forceful push to ratify the ERA is needed today. And we're thrilled to have Eljoy Williams back with us as moderator for tonight's conversation. Eljoy is a political strategist and analyst, a regularly featured commentator on MSNBC and New York One, and also president of the Brooklyn NAACP. In addition, and this is something that is very, very close to our hearts here at the New York Public Library, she is the founder and co-host of the weekly Sirius XM radio show, Sunday Civics, which is designed to teach civics using the current political landscape and thereby empower communities with the knowledge and skills necessary to be active participants in democracy. So they will speak for about 45 minutes and then take your questions. If you are in the room, you can write your questions on the note cards that were handed out to you when you came into the auditorium. If you are joining us online, you can just type them into the chat or send us an email at publicprograms@nypl.org. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Isfahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and of course by all of you, our wonderful supporters and friends. So thank you so much for that support. Thank you for being with us. And now, please welcome Eljoy Williams, Carolyn Maloney, Kate Shaw, and Christian Nunes.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Eljoy Williams. Thank you so much for coming out and joining us this evening for what will be a great conversation that I hope promotes action. Action not only in this room and amongst those of us who are here, but action in Congress, action in this country to move on this important ERA. How many of you, by show of hands, went to see the exhibition already? Wonderful. So a number
about
of you
online? I saw it online.
Okay. So a number of us still need to make it there. It was a pleasure for me to come last week and get a tour and to hear directly from the curators who I believe are in the room, and to bring my daughters, my 14-year-old and my 8-year-old, for them to experience this as well. And so I want to get right into our conversation because we have a short time together. But I want to start with the historical perspective, because if you have not gone and seen the exhibition, it gives that historical context of what was going on and what the initial reason was for proposing this amendment. So, Christian, I want to start with you from the beginning. Not that you were there, but but obviously, I want to start with you, and if you can help level set, and I'm sure others will join in. What was happening, and what was the reason for beginning this endeavor to get the Equal Rights Amendment?
Thank you so much, Eljoy, for that question. And thank you, Newark Public Library Live series, for just having now be a part of this conversation. National Organization for Women has been involved with the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment from the very beginning of our organization's founding. You know, we were founded in 1966, and from 1967, our second annual conference, where our membership actually has our resolutions and has our governing body decide what we're going to do, we adopted a resolution to actually push the Equal Rights Amendment forward. And that is because we really truly believed in constitutional equality and the right for women to be considered equal and to have their rights and their protections. So right away, we decided that that was very important to our organization, that women were protected, and we spearheaded a campaign from the very beginning to make sure that women were protected. And since then, we were fierce advocates, grassroots advocates who did everything in our power to make sure that the organization, from being involved in Senate hearings, disrupting Senate hearings. I mean, 1970, you know, our president, Eileen Hernandez, Representative Shirley Chisholm, disrupted a Senate hearing demanding that the ERA was brought to Congress, and they made sure they were heard about it, from going forward to demanding that it was upheld, and we heard it, and it was brought to Congress. I mean, we organized the largest marches. We had the March for Equality. Carolyn Maloney, from 1983 on, you know, I was very involved in bringing forth the ERA every time, and now was extremely involved in making sure the states pushed forward and ratified it in the states. So I would say that ever since the organization was founded, we made sure that we were extremely involved in the process of pushing forth the ERA, and we have continued to make sure we've done that in every part. And our organization and our chapters have been extremely involved in making sure that it has been ratified in the states going forth.
Well, before we get to Carolyn Maloney, because I'm sure she has a number of stories about how she continued to introduce and fight for this, but Kate, I'm going to put you on the spot. Sure, yeah. Because I'm a civics teacher at heart, and I believe in educating people along the way and not assuming that everybody in the room knows what we're talking about. So I'm going to put you on the spot and to level set and say what the ERA actually is. What does it do?
Sure. Well, let me actually read the text of the amendment that has been, well, that is now at its 100th anniversary of the initial introduction, so 1920, so well before now, right?
Yes.
The Equal Rights Amendment is introduced in Congress for the first time in 1923, but in many ways, its history is even older, right? You can think about 1848 in Seneca Falls as actually the origin site and moment, and you could maybe, you could think about 1868 when the 14th Amendment is drafted and ratified, and early feminists like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are really advocating to have equality not just on the basis of race, but also on the basis of sex, enshrined within the explicit text of the 14th Amendment. That effort fails. In fact, the 14th Amendment actually includes the word male for the first time in the Constitution. So we have lots of different moments that sort of could count as origin moments. I'm not sure what the final answer is, but this is an effort that has, been underway nearly as long as this country has been around, right? You can think about Abigail Adams, remember the ladies' letter. Anyway, many, many moments one could pinpoint. But in terms of what this version of the ERA that is adopted by Congress in 1972 says, it's pretty simple, right? Equality of rights under the law. I'm sure that Representative Maloney could say this from heart, but I will actually read it. Forgive me, but I don't have it committed to memory. But equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. It's pretty straightforward, right? Most democracies have explicit guarantees of sex equality in their written constitutions. We're kind of an outlier in not having that. So that is the effort that has been underway all this time that really looked as though it was coming very close to success, sailing through ratification as the 1970s wore on and then ground to a halt in the 1970s, and really has come back with this important vengeance really since 2017 when we actually have exceeded the threshold for state ratification of 38 states. I could go on, but I'll stop there.
Well, look, I'm glad to have you to level set us in that context of it, and even more excited that we actually have the former Congresswoman here to talk a little bit more about the advocacy in Congress. One of the things that stood out for me in the exhibition, that's in the beginning of the exhibition, is the text of the amendment, and it's one page. Haven't you ever read legislation? Has it ever been one page in your lifetime, right? But to that point that it is so simple and yet so hard, can you give us just your experience and your advocacy in Congress on this one page amendment that we've been fighting for?
Thank you so much, first of all, to the New York Public Library for having the exhibition, for having this forum, and for shedding light on this very important amendment, which is probably more important now than ever before. For the first time in my life, fundamental rights, civil rights that I thought we had have been erased with the Dobbs decision. There have been allegations of other movements to ban access to contraceptives and other things that take away rights that we took for granted. It's horrifying to me that my daughters have less rights than what I had at their age. The amendment was written by Alice Paul. She happens to be a first cousin of my late husband's grandmother. And she introduced it right after the right to vote passed in 1920. She introduced it in New York State, in Seneca Falls, the liberty, the equality state. And she said, if we don't watch out, we'll be back in Seneca Falls and 50 years later, and we still won't have our equal rights. The suffragettes thought that with the right to vote would come other powers, and that the Equal Rights Amendment would protect women. Now it's been 100 years since that first introduction in Congress. Roughly 50 years later, it was passed by 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate in 1971 and 72, and very quickly 35 states ratified it. The Republicans added at the last amendment, at the last moment, they added a time limit of 7 years to get it ratified. And Ellie Smeal, a friend of mine, said they ran over to Alice Paul's house to tell her that we've ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. Aren't you excited? We passed it in the House and the Senate. And they told her about the time limit, and she started crying. She was sitting at Susan B. Anthony's desk. She knew that they would not be able to meet that time limit. But constitutional scholars, as Kate will point out, have said that Congress can add a time limit, but Congress can take it away. And when we ratified it, through the 38 states, the last 3 states to ratify were Nevada, Illinois, Virginia, finally in 2020. And so now I can tell you, my entire life in the City Council and in Congress, I've worked for the Equal Rights Amendment. I can honestly say we have never been closer in my lifetime towards achieving this goal. And probably it's never been more important, because rights that we thought we had are being taken away. And they'll take more if we don't fight and push back. For the first time, when I was leaving Congress, I spent my last 3 weeks circulating a petition to all of my colleagues. I got 150 signatures, a meeting with Senator Schumer, asking him to immediately schedule a vote and hearing on the Equal Rights Amendment. He wasn't able to do it in the last Congress. He was true to his word in this Congress. On April 28th, we had a meeting and a hearing in the Judiciary Committee, the first in 40 years, and the first vote in 40 years. It passed. We got a majority of votes, but under the Senate rules, they needed 60 votes. He did a procedural move. We can go back for another vote this session, either reaching the 60 or getting a carve-out from the filibuster requirement of 60 because of the importance of equality. So we have, for the first time, the same bill in the House and in the Senate. And the bill removes the time limit and is a sense of Congress that it has been ratified, that it has met all of the requirements of Article 5, which President Biden has asked for. And that is a 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate and ratified by 38 states. I say it's already been ratified because we've met all the requirements, but there's always more hurdles when you're a woman. I can tell you I authored and passed over 80 bills. I had 13 bill signings with 5 different presidents for transformational legislation, but the hardest thing I ever did, whether it was paid leave for the birth of a child, paid leave for federal employees, anything to help women, was like really, even creating a museum, the only one for women in the whole country, dedicated to women's achievements on the Mall. It was more difficult than anything else I ever did. There's a tremendous pushback that is in Congress. But in any event, we have now, during this Congress, this session, before the 2024 election, our goal is to get a vote in both the House and the Senate, and hopefully to pass it and ratify it. But if not, hold people accountable for voting against the rights for women. And I would say that it's changed in my lifetime. When we passed the ERA in the 1970s, we were at 60% approval rate. We're now at 85. And you saw in the last election that in red states, in Kentucky, a Democratic governor was elected, and Ohio, now considered a red state. We passed legislation to put the right to an abortion in the Constitution of that state. And then, very importantly, in Virginia, again, a red state, which they put a lot of emphasis on, we flipped the House to the Democratic side. 3 tremendous wins. So I think that the momentum is there. I could see during my time in Congress that we needed one organization to focus on the Equal Rights Amendment. So I encouraged some friends to found something called the ERA Coalition. And it's over 300 different organizations dedicated to passing the ERA. Combined membership is over 80 million people. Now is the largest grassroots movement of women's rights in the country. They're firmly behind it. So there are many ingredients coming. And join us on December 13th. We're having a march from the White House to the Capitol in support of the Equal Rights Amendment.
Well,
and
we're going to have time to make sure that you write down those dates and get some additional information on what you can take in. But I want to get Kate back into this conversation because as a law professor, I want you to share with us how you interpret, because, law is all about interpretation, as we see what's happening with the Supreme Court. How do you interpret the legal implications that the ERA could have in today's context?
Sure. And maybe before I do that, can I just start with a broader point?
Sure.
Which is that, and you mentioned the Supreme Court. I think that reviving the prospect of amending the Constitution is a critical project for kind of the long-term health of our democracy. And I think the ERA is not just like, one random example. I think the ERA is incredibly important in its own right. I'll talk about that in a minute. But I also just think more broadly, we do live in a moment where we have come to view our Constitution as, essentially unamendable, right? Like the last meaningful amendment was in 1971. Like many people have come of age without actually any constitutional memory of change, right? Like the document is fixed, and it is by design difficult to amend. So 2/3 in each House of Congress and 3/4 of the states, and that is a very, very difficult set of supermajority kind of hurdles to clear. And I think obviously we're in very polarized times. And so we have the kind of what feels like the impossibility of amending the Constitution, and then you have this kind of like loss of muscle memory of actually doing it, so it feels impossible. And I think when you combine that with a Supreme Court that's incredibly powerful, and a Supreme Court that has, the majority of which at least, has committed itself to a method of interpreting the Constitution that binds us to a long, distant past, the kind of disconnect between present conditions and needs and desires and the document that's unamendable and not even interpretable in ways that give value, sort of implement our current values, it's simply an untenable state of affairs. And I think there are many, many aspects of the Constitution that are badly in need of change. So I would hope that what the ERA does is, if in fact it manages to successfully overcome the hurdles, as Representative Maloney said, there is an argument that it is actually already the 28th Amendment of the Constitution. Yeah. Many people think that, and that is not a frivolous argument. Now, how to get that recognized is the challenge, because of both the time limit and the fact that a couple of states that initially were in the 35 that ratified have subsequently sought to rescind their ratification. So you have a couple of sort of distinct legal questions that those present. But so there's the kind of broader, I just think getting us unstuck, the ERA feels like it could do that much more broadly than sex equality. But not.
Well, before you get there, because so Kate, there's a whole generation of us, right, who grew up learning with a little song how to actually introduce and pass legislation, right? Raise your hand if you're old.
Rock.
Okay.
Yeah, yep.
All right. So you're saying that in terms, there obviously are generations after us, right, that don't know or know in theory about amending the Constitution, but did not have the actual practice of doing so, or don't even know the basics of how you do that, right? That you need not only the vote in Congress, but then you also need the states to act as well.
Yeah.
So there's also, again, another common theme of the civic education of people realizing that they have a role in this, that it's not just something you can hand off to people to do, but you have to actually participate
And
in.
that's why the revival in Nevada and Illinois and Virginia and in other states has just been really inspiring to see. It does feel like a new generation of advocates and activists have really sort of learned the process of constitutional amendment, and sometimes in states that have either there was already ratification or there's just been sort of a renewed push, there have been other downstream effects of adding, say, ERAs to state constitutions or improving sex equality guarantees under state statutes. So there's all kinds of ways that this, I think, movement has actually resulted in formal legal change, even though we're not yet at a point where everyone agrees that the constitutional amendment has successfully been ratified. But maybe just for a second, in terms of what if we were in a place where we all agreed that the Equal Rights Amendment was part of the Constitution, what would it do? Well, we are, as I said a minute ago, in a position where we have an incredibly powerful Supreme Court, and the interpretation of the words of the amendment would lie with that Supreme Court, and I am frankly pretty nervous about what kind of interpretation this Supreme Court would give to the language of the Equal Rights Amendment. But I don't think they could just dismiss out of hand that sex equality guarantees actually entail a right to bodily autonomy, including a decision whether to continue with or to terminate a pregnancy. That was just dismissed in about 2 sentences in the Alito majority opinion in the Dobbs case, which overruled Roe, and the court would have to take much more seriously the sex equality argument based on a newly added sex equality guarantee in the Constitution. So it might, I think properly understood, it would guarantee a right to terminate a pregnancy. I think it would guarantee rights against employment discrimination on the basis of sex, pregnancy discrimination. It might require Congress to pass legislation doing things like paid leave, childcare potentially. I mean, there's all sorts of affirmative obligations it could be understood to impose on legislators, in addition to what it would mean, in terms of its direct relationship to individuals and to state laws. So I think there's a lot, but a lot would also lie in the interpretation that the Supreme Court would give to these words.
And I can imagine that, with the new amendment, similar to how the passing of other amendments, that it would also pose new challenges, right? People would sue based upon and challenging state laws and challenging, corporate, practices to actually address some of that as well. So it would also empower people to actually challenge other things that are inequitable in our society as well.
I think it's right that I think it would at least open up the possibility of fundamentally overhauling many, many ways we treat pregnancy, parenthood, intimate and family life. And so, yes, a ton of litigation. And also, but it's not just courts, right? I think that part of what the ERA would do was empower, again, Congress and state lawmakers to actually give force to the guarantees of sex equality. So I think courts would be part of it, but not the whole story.
Yeah.
I would say that, simply put, it would allow Congress and the courts in the country to enforce equal pay for equal work. Every year for 40 years, I've done studies on the pay discrimination that results in older women being the largest segment of poverty in our country because they are underpaid, they are not, often don't get Social Security, and so forth. So it would empower them to enforce equal pay for equal work, and every study shows that at least there's a 20% gap between men and women for the same job, and it's much wider for women of color. I would say also in the area of sexual violence, one of the worst Supreme Court decisions was the Brancala decision, where she went to VMI and was gang raped in front of a lot of people. And she brought suit against the school, they did nothing. Against the city council, they did nothing. Against the state, goes to the federal government. And even though the rapist confessed he did it, they threw it out because women are not in the Constitution. So if you were in the Constitution, then Congress would be empowered to pass numerous bills to protect women in cases of sexual violence, unequal pay, pregnancy discrimination, and all other forms of discrimination. Now, I would think that the Equal Rights Amendment, which only wants to treat half the population equally, should be like having a glass of water. I don't understand why there's such resistance to it. And I really felt like if I had the money, I would have taken out an ad at the airport that said, "Welcome to the only country that does not have women's rights in the Constitution in the Western Hemisphere," when we had the United Nations coming in. So when you think about it and look at in the world view, Ireland, which was very conservative, they just passed the right to abortion. Argentina passed the right to abortion. Here in America, they're taking it away. With one stroke of the Supreme Court, they took rights to abortion away from 30 million women in those states that had basically banned it. And I don't know of any medical decision that a man has to take that puts his life at risk. Women literally have to be almost dying before they'll perform an abortion. As one doctor in Ohio said, "I don't want to be a travel agent telling everybody where to go. I'm a doctor. I can tell people what is in their best interest for their health, to survive, to be able to reproduce and not lose their reproductive abilities." So the Equal Rights Amendment also, oh my God, did you read the Dobbs decision where Alito goes back to, what was his name, Matthew
Hale.
Hale, she's got it. It's the 17th century. And if you read this guy, he believed in witchcraft. Seriously. He convicted 2 women, hung them as witches. And he's quoting Matthew Hale for his decision. Now, I'd like Kate to talk a little bit about this. Apparently, these decisions.
She's the moderator now.
Let's go after Matthew Hale. Listen. When they make these decisions, they have to go back to when the last amendment was, or back when the Constitution was created. If we got the amendment passed in 2023, they could reference how women are treated now with much more equality than they were in the 17th century. So the whole thing is, why can't we get this done if we all work together? And I have an answer. Very quickly, I have a petition. I'm going to put this up in the chat. And if you go to your cell phone and go to sign letter4era.org, you can become a petition champion. It's not an ordinary petition. This petition is breaking it down by congressional districts across the country so that we can contact people to contact their legislators and find out whether they are for or against the Equal Rights Amendment. And if they're against it, then they should run against them, right? And we've got to change this. And how we change it is we have to pass it in the House and the Senate, and we have to elect a pro-equality majority. And I'd like to get a vote, because who's going to vote against equality for women?
So with that, I want to acknowledge the lovely folks that we have in the aisles that are holding up index cards, so that if you have additional questions that you would like to be passed up so that we can engage in this conversation on the stage, please feel free to do that. Just raise your hand for the folks that are coming through the aisle. Christian, I want to bring you back into the conversation. One of the aspects of the exhibition talks about the opposition that was also organized against the ERA. And a number of the initial or conversations that people had, you know, granted there are people taking advantage of the of the situation, but it seems to be a lot of educational issues of people not understanding how it would impact them, thinking that it would change their way of life, or things of that nature. Do you really see a opposition that exists now? And if so, what education do we need to provide for people to understand that this is not a harmful, but that this is actually an empowering thing for us to move forward on?
Right. So that's a really great question, Eljoy. And I actually see the exact same opposition that occurred back then occurring right now. And that is the opposition of difference. It's the opposition of lack of understanding and ignorance. And I say that because when we think about the opposition that was occurring back then, a lot of the arguments that were taking place were about issues about LGBTQIA issues, same-sex marriage, women going to work, women, not becoming caregivers or, taking care of their families anymore, women losing their position in the household, women becoming too manly, the same problems that we're seeing in this movement now with the opposition that we're hearing from the right to life movements, the anti-movements that we're seeing right now. So it's the same conversations and the same resistancy that we're seeing about anything that does not fit the viewpoints of those who are originally, once again, in the original Constitution. We're seeing the exact same opposition, and so any resistance that we do not recognize and we do not see or we don't feel comfortable with is what they're forcing against. The right-wing extremists, it's the same thing, right? And so now it's just more misinformation, disinformation that's being fed into the campaign right now to encourage people to believe that we should not have equality. Women should still be considered second-class citizens, that if we give them equality, what that will mean is that we will have, this weird, this just is this really bizarre crazy belief system that they have about where women would stand, and it's just really made up. It's really just to create just a really another position to just control women even further and more. So I think we have to look at what we're seeing. It's just really mimicking the same thing we saw back in that time. So what we have to continue to do is create really a truth campaign, continue to push the truth and information, continue to get out there and educate on our issues, show really what is existing, what is the truth, continue to show the positive parts of what can happen with the Equal Rights Amendment, show the benefits of what can come from the Equal Rights Amendment, show how it has showed positive examples, show how millennials, Gen Z, 99% approve the Equal Rights Amendment, show how it's benefited many people, how it advances, equality, how it advances equity and inclusion, how it dismisses so much senses of oppression that we've been experiencing for so long. This is what we have to do. We have to fight the misinformation, disinformation that we see with examples of what happens when we fight against these things.
Yeah. If just before we go to you, Kate, because I want to continue with Christian for a moment, because you talk about the Gen Z, and I don't know what the names are, the people after me, right? And that there is this incredible support. In fact, they may not know ERA, the amendment, or the movement, but they know fundamentally that this is basic rights that we should have as human beings, right? How is now, and Carolyn, if you want to jump in terms of the ERA coalition overall, mobilizing those next generations? Because I can tell you, I remember in my college and early year the ERA, but I thought it was like the ladies who lunch and the tea ladies. That's the thing that they do. Like, there was no connection to me of needing to get involved in the fight for an ERA amendment. I thought it was the ladies who lunch crowd. That's y'all advocacy thing, right? But clearly the generations now know that fundamentally. How are we harnessing their power, their voices into the new fight for the ERA amendment?
Well, what I will say is I think they're harnessing their own voices, and I think there is one group particularly I'll speak to, and I'll give credit, is Generation Ratify. They are a youth-led movement who are leading with fighting for the Equal Rights Amendment. They're made up of high school and college students, and they are leading the movement themselves. They have their own voice, and I think sometimes we have to recognize that the youth have their own voice. We don't need to help them. We have to allow them the space to lead in their own space, in their own way, and share the space, and share the table, instead of always assuming that we can offer, and we and give it insight, but we don't always have to have them do it the way that we did it. And I think that's super important. And I think part of the way we expand movement and we grow is to understand that movement is going to be different. And there's multiple movements in a movement, right? And that's understanding that the way we communicate will be different, but it's still going to help if we're all moving for the same purpose and the same outcome. So I think that's what we see with this new youth movement and this young adult movement, and we have to allow them to move in their way, knowing that we're all coming for the same goal and the same cause.
Just wanted to jump in and say, in addition to, I think Christian's exactly right, that many of the opposition sort of arguments today are just echoes of long-standing arguments. But I also think there's a strain of ERA opposition, which is something like, it's not necessary because women are already equal. So that, right, I think, is a somewhat new strain of argument. And I think it was effective in some quarters for some time, and I think post-Dobbs it is much more difficult to make that argument resonate. Absolutely. So I actually think there's an enormous opportunity to convince some previous, like fence sitters. I'm not sure. It seems like the equality guarantees in the 14th Amendment have largely been interpreted to extend to protect on the basis, against discrimination on the basis of sex, in addition to on the basis of race and other protected characteristics. So we've already done that through the 14th Amendment, and actually, women are relatively equal. So I don't know that we need to amend this is not me. I'm just channeling the argument. I'm not saying it. But I think that was sort of attractive to people for a long time. And I actually think there's not really a silver lining to Dobbs at all. But if there were one, I think that giving the lie to that line is maybe what I would point to, because I think it makes crystal clear. And I think that for women who came of age in a post-Roe era, not that they ever should have been sort of inured to the reality of pay discrimination and many, many other, both formal and informal kind of modes of inequality, but many I think were, and I actually think that Dobbs makes clear that that was all fiction, actually. That, in fact, not that it was all fiction, but in fact, we have a long way to go, and maybe that actually could impel even more members of a new generation to actually make this an issue that they care a great deal about and work very hard on, and maybe then we get there.
And building on Generation Ratify, which is young people speaking out, we went to Seneca Falls and we had many young people, and here in New York, Hunter College has started a ERA Now Club, and they are organizing hearings at the 28 CUNY campuses on the need for the ERA. It's really their future. It's going to have an impact on their lives, and they're taking responsibility, speaking out, and making a difference.
Wonderful. I'm going to make a plug again for any questions that need to be passed. If you have questions, to see the folks walking with the cards so we can get them in. Just paying attention to the time. So I want to make sure we get those questions in as possible. And this is really for any of you on how the ERA intersects with other issues that are also advocates are fighting for at this time, whether that's racial justice issues. When you were talking about women not being in the Constitution, I think about our right to vote not being affirmed in the Constitution, right? And so if we had an amendment that everybody knows you don't have a constitutional right to vote, right? You know that? Okay. So, but then talking about that, like how that would, defeat some of what is happening in states across the country in that similar vein.
I would love to answer this question because I really believe the areas have a nexus of the intersectional movement, because we look at racial justice, we look at violence against women, we look at LGBTQIA rights, we look at all these different things. We know that majority of the marginalized communities, majority of the BIPOC communities, disabled communities, all of their rights and the levels of oppression are the most, and they're most disenfranchised, and they're also the most that are not protected and never have been protected in the Constitution. So when we're fighting for their rights, we have to look at how the Equal Rights Amendment would guarantee that they are truly protected. And so we have to really think about that. Those groups, persons of color, disabled persons, their voting rights. And to this day, even when we talk about equal pay, we know that persons with disability, persons with intellectual disability are paid even tremendously less, are not even paid like minimum wage, We have to think about that. We have to think about the fact that when we're talking about pay equity, you say 80 cents on the dollar, but when we talk about, persons of color, that even breaks down even further, when we're talking
54 cents to the dollar.
Even, and sometimes even lower, right? So we have to look at that. When we're talking about, we're even talking about, violence against women and protections and loopholes. We're talking about rape kits, and we know that when we're looking at Black and brown women, we know that majority of their rape kits are not even, processed.
Right.
And then majority of their cases are not even investigated or prosecuted, And so there's so many things we have to look at when and then there are charges and things are just not prosecuted, and there's so much discrimination and oppression and bias that goes into these things. So we have to look at the nexus and the intersectionality that happens with these things, and how, if we truly are trying to make sure there is equity and equality, we need the Equal Rights Amendment to protect everyone. And that is why there is an intersection between all these movements, and the Equal Rights Amendment is truly needed.
Well, I have some great questions up here from the audience. Thank you.
And I must say that we have a state resolution on the ballot in 2024, which is an expanded ERA that covers LGBTQ, all disabilities, and all the areas that Christian was mentioning. So get out and vote in 2024.
Well, Carolyn mentioned to that. I have a question from the audience about that. The professors McKinnon and Crenshaw have written an updated and more intersectional ERA. Would it be safer to ratify that version than try to avoid reinterpretation issues from the original version that was introduced?
I mean, I think that's very hard because we have made so much progress. It would be starting from scratch. So I think I am not a political tactician. I defer to others on the panel as to what makes the most sense strategically. I think it is right that the ERA has, as drafted and as passed by Congress and ratified by 38 states, can absolutely be interpreted in expansive ways. I also think it could be written in more expansive ways. And so probably if we were starting from scratch today, we would write something more expansive and more intersectional. And yet, it feels risky to me to suggest that we should start over. It's hard to get to 2/3 of each house of Congress.
Yeah.
And so that's my fear.
I would say if we had to start over, forget it. It's not going to be in our lifetime. The country's more conservative now than it was in 1971. They just took away a
Well,
woman's right to choose. They
Is the
just took
country
it-
more conservative, or are the people in power more conservative
Great.
and louder?
Great question.
I would say that all of the above. But what has changed and why this may pass is because women are half the population. So that's half the population. If they really got out there and pushed it, they would be able to push it through.
But let me ask- let-
secondly, this is very, very important. What the polling is showing is that Republicans are supporting the ERA, not their leaders, but the Republicans. The polling, Celinda Lake, who is a pollster for President Biden and the Ms. magazine, she told in her poll, she said, it is polling better than anything, save the economy and inflation. It is polling at 85%, which is almost unbelievable when you put abortion and equal rights together for women.
That answers the
I
other
wanna
question.
win.
That answers the other question on if there is Republican support on that. But I want to, given your experience, right? I want to ask, the working on the current version, couldn't Congress then also follow up with additional legislation that
Absolutely.
then adds the expansive
Absolutely.
language and rights that we're talking about from that
Yes. Yes,
standpoint?
they could.
Similar on the Voting Rights Act, right?
Yes, but it's hard. It's not easy, let me tell you.
Yes. So if the ERA passes, how will it impact transgender women?
Well, the courts have covered transgender women.
Well, as a statutory, right, so the question is, if what the court does in interpreting the ERA is essentially follow what it has said about sex discrimination under Title VII, just a federal statute, it would say that discrimination on the basis of gender identity or transgender status is sex discrimination. And so if it would follow from that, it's the Bostock decision, and so that's even, this conservative court said that. And so I think if the court is true to its precedent, it's not, it's a statute again and not a constitutional amendment, but it would seem to follow, almost undeniably that being true to Bostock would suggest that yes, discrimination on the basis again of gender identity or transgender status is sex discrimination and thus, falls within the prohibition of this version of the ERA.
But that's also assuming that the court will not contort and
That's a big assumption. Yeah.
twist itself.
But the Bostock decision is written by Neil Gorsuch, who's one of the most conservative justices on the Supreme Court. So I think that gives some hope that this court would interpret the prohibition here in the same way.
So this question is, I think, really important, that there hasn't been much publicity in the media, in news and conversation. You hear about fights and advocacy for ERA at the New York Public Library. Not necessarily on the big channel news, not necessarily on your local news. How do we combat the cycle that we're in to only report on the happenings of one individual and not necessarily all of the advocacy such as the ERA amendment?
Well, we need a press that will cover it. It's not that we don't send out press releases. It's not that we haven't had a vote in the Senate. It's not that we haven't had hearings on it, that we're having a march on the 13th. We had an event in Washington just 2 weekends ago. We send out releases, but oftentimes women's issues are not swept under the rug or not thought about at all. So we have to work harder at it because it's important to receive recognition and understanding of what's happening, and that's why the New York Public Library needs to be thanked again and again for allowing and having an exhibition on it and having this forum tonight.
And I just want to piggyback off of what Carolyn's saying, and I think that we as a country have to get to a position where the welfare and the livelihood and the benefit of women is a priority. And when we get there, then we'll report on it. Because right now, that's why we're not reporting on it. That's just the truth. Like, we don't report on the welfare of women. We don't report on the benefit of women. We don't report on the advancement of women. We just don't. I mean, you know, and until we get to that place where that is our priority, that is our level of comfort, we're not going to hear about it. I mean, that's just what it gets down to. I mean, and so we have to get to that place that is our comfort level, to say, let us uplift these stories and these narratives of what women are, and then we will start reporting on it. Until we get there, it's going to be something.
And building
that we
on
have
what
to-
Christian said, I think that it's hard to empower women if you don't even recognize them. And I'm going to tell a story. You asked for stories on the battle. I was walking around the mall trying to figure out how to gain more Republican support for the ERA. And I walked all the way around the mall, which speaks to the values of this country. And they had museums on law and order, space, all arts, you name it. It was all in the mall. I started asking, where are the women? They're half the population. There was no museum or mention of women in the entire mall. So I came back and I wrote a bill and said, let's have a women's museum on the mall. Everyone will agree, and that will be easy to pass. We'll have confidence building. We'll build support with Republicans. They'll support the ERA. I put the bill in. It took me 20 years to pass it, and I worked on it. It was one of the hardest things. A museum, that's not controversial. That is just the history of what women have contributed in the sciences, in education, in all of the areas that women have worked alongside men. Every other museum has been for men, for wars, for space travel, you name it. But there's not one, and I thought it's just not on the mall. I looked at it, there's nowhere in the whole United States that there's a museum dedicated to women. We have sliver museums, like in Seneca Falls, they have where the first women's rights took place. We have an arts museum in Washington, Annie Oakley in Oklahoma, women going out west and Los Angeles, but not a comprehensive, it's long overdue. So it's part of this whole effort to recognize the contributions of women. And you think about it, how are you going to empower or get them in the Constitution if you're not going to even write the stories of what they've contributed to make this country great?
Absolutely.
So I have a couple of questions here about convincing others, particularly the other half of the country, that this is in their best interests, men, by the way. And then also, you know, what are the incentives that people who are opposing ERA think we supposedly have? I'm unaware of that as well. I would also like to know.
I would say at the hearings that we had, the Republicans raised two issues. One was the time limit. The time limit had been there. Well, our legislation removes the time limit. The second was that it's been 40 years. Forget the polls. We don't know where America stands. That's the importance of the petition and the support of passing the resolution, which basically says we've met all of the requirements of Article 5. Already it's done. Mm-hmm. And it took us 50 years to do it, to get us to the point that we are now. After having passed the bill, it took us that long to get to this point now. Yeah. So that's what they say, so our bill takes care of that. And when you pass legislation, I would always try to figure out what's their arguments against and take them against. I testified twice before Mike Thompson, the new leader of the House, and one was on the 9/11 Health and Compensation Bill, which he supported, and the other was on the ERA, and he was opposed to it based on the time limit and the time span. Our bill takes care of that.
Mm. So, Kate, you know, I said this to all of you in the back, that as Americans, we are conditioned that the entire universe revolves around us. But I would, love not only for yourself, but, any of our other panelists to talk about how the movement for ERA compares to gender equality movements globally.
Yeah. I'm not a comparative scholar, but and Representative Maloney said this at the outset, but we really are an outlier, at least in terms of the text of our, charter document. Not having an explicit sex equality guarantee really does make us an outlier among peer nations, and it also is the case. Now, documents contain lots of promises, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean anything about the conditions on the ground, but the actual social policies in at least many other democracies are far more protective of women, more protective of families and pregnancy, and the lack of genuine paid leave as a matter of federal law remains an outlier and a travesty sort of condition of American life. And so there are lots of places where I think we lag very, very far behind. And when it comes to reproductive rights and justice and access to abortion specifically, we really are on what feels like this inverse trajectory from a lot of the world, right? So the Mexican Supreme Court just in September essentially decriminalized abortion. We talked about Ireland, that Mexico is just the latest in a trend that is sort of sweeping across Latin America. And you now, you have countries like, so Mexico now, abortion is essentially decriminalized. And I think there are women who have been, working to provide access in conditions of criminalization, but figure out ways to provide access to women in need in Mexico for many, many years, who are now providing counsel to their counterparts across the border who are looking in states like Texas to provide counsel and care to women who are living in conditions of criminalization of abortion care. And so I think that on the ground, there is a lot of kind of cross-pollination and learning, seeking actively to learn from, others in other nations that I think is happening in the U.S. right now. So that's not something I think you're right. Like this notion that we have only to teach and not to learn from the rest of the world is something that is in a lot of American DNA, and that is not. I think that the incorrectness of that general proposition, I think, is really starkly on display, particularly in the context of reproductive rights and justice in a post-Dobbs era, but maybe more broadly when it comes to sex equality. So there is a lot to learn, and I think that there are people, at least in a lot of quarters, that are eager to do that.
Yeah. Well, the time is closing. I didn't realize how quickly this would go by, but I wanted to give you another opportunity, Carolyn. I know you came with your props on this, but also to talk about, I'll start with Carolyn and come down the line, give the audience action steps, both those here in the audience and those watching. What are some things they can actively do to propel this forward? You mentioned December 3rd?
13th. It's the 100th anniversary of the introduction of the ERA. And so we're having a march in Washington. But what you can do, what every single person can do, and it's important, is participate in your democracy by signing the petition and being part of the grassroots effort to pass the ERA. Just go to your cell phones and go to sign, S-I-G-N, the letter 4, ERA.org, and get into the system of network of all of us that are working to pass it. And obviously, signing is one individual action, but you can become a petition champion. We have a meeting at 4 o'clock on the Zoom on Waywe's. We'll put it in the chat so that you can participate in that. Through the organizations that you're a member of, get them to join the ERA coalition. I think 80 million is pretty impressive, but our population is 350 million. Let's keep adding organizations and voices to the ERA coalition, which is dedicated completely and totally towards trying to get this ratified. And pray to God for some inspiration and passion, because what is so difficult about this? Why are we for 100 years trying to pass a resolution that the rest of the Western world has already passed, and that is really a basic belief in our democracy of equality of opportunity? And I would say that we can't compete and win in the world economy unless we develop the abilities of all of our citizens to the utmost, men and women, to make as big a contribution as they can to their families and to their country. But I want to thank again the the library. Thank you so much, Faye, for putting this together.
Christian?
So I would also just encourage everyone to get involved in the movement. We know.
Join now.
I'm going to say it. I would not be the president if I did not encourage everyone to join now.
Okay.
But I would just say that, what we have seen happen that has really helped us and mobilize the power of the grassroots and voters and organizers and activists that have shifted and took back and said we will not tolerate people taking away our rights, people taking away our constitutional rights. And so there is power in the people. We have always seen power in the people. The most progressive movements, the most amazing movements to change has always shifted because people have organized and people have said that we know that we deserve this power. We are worth this much. We have this right to take this power. So I'm going to encourage everyone to get involved. Join now chapters, join the ERA Coalition, join, and also continue to work in your own state. If your state does not have the ERA, continue to push to have the ERA in your state. Because just because we have 38 states doesn't mean we cannot have 50 states. So keep pushing to get the ERA in your own state as well, because you can make sure you have protections in your state as we continue to push for Congress to ratify as well. So just continue to move forward, join the organizations, find out what's happening, and just make sure we all recognize that, even if we personally don't understand something, if one of us is suffering and one of us does not have freedom or one of us is oppressed, we are all essentially oppressed. And so we have to push for the liberation of everyone. And so I'm going to move that on. Thank you.
We should have started the final remarks in a different order. Please, Eljoy. I'm the academic here, so I'm not going to match those closings. But I will say I do think that this is an effort that has been underway, obviously, for a very long time. But that we are in a fundamentally different landscape right now, and I really do think that Dobbs has changed many of the rules of political gravity. Right, every single time Americans have gone to the ballot since Dobbs, and to vote on abortion specifically, they have voted either to enshrine protections in the law or to roll back efforts to prohibit protections. It has been a really remarkable trend, and now we don't have direct democracy for amending the Constitution, right? That's not how we amend our Constitution, but there are lots of mechanisms that, like petitions, that can be used to actually bring that kind of popular pressure to bear on the kind of gatekeepers of the actual constitutional amendment process. And so it does feel to me as though that post-Dobbs energy absolutely can be channeled in an effort to finally get this long-standing effort across the finish line. It does feel like we are closer than we ever have been before, and the tools are all there. It's just a question of people actually picking them up and using them. So that was my less rousing, but my law professor answer.
Well, and thanks to all of you, those of you who are physically here and those who are on the live stream, for joining us for this important conversation, and to try to get every single question in. But for that last person that asked how we can use online platforms, I think all of our panelists just gave examples, whether it's petitions, continuing to speak, changing the frame of what media is covering or not covering, I think is an important way to use social media, to use online tools in order to change the conversation, and make sure that passing the ERA is something that will be a front and center topic as we go into this next election cycle. So thank you to the New York Public Library, and thanks to all of you.